The colonial period of North America takes place during the 18th century, that is the 1700s. The 18th century is a time in which humanity received one of those periodic jolts forward in its collective intellectual consciousness. We call this particular period the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment is a period that is characterized by the use of reason and evidence over divine revelation. We are putting aside the old medieval means of discerning reality, and instead we're looking at a more modern form of let us examine things and write about them and explain them and postulate about them. This especially is important when it comes to science, but it also is important when it comes to politics. And so our 18th century philosophers, who are mathematicians, they are philosophers, they are political scientists, and so forth, they are going to begin to examine the nature of government and its relation to those whom they govern. And then we'll see how it affects the 13 colonies. We will see the beginnings of secularism in the colonies. Even though the colonies still have established religions, you're beginning to see a separation of church and state in a tacit form, not a governmental form yet, but a tacit form. And then we'll see African slavery, one of the things that the 18th century philosophers invade against. And then we'll see life in the mid-Atlantic regions. The period of the Enlightenment was defined and dominated by a series of writers and philosophers whom the French called philosophes. We call them philosophers. Men such as Denis Diderot, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Baron de Montesquieu, who gives us the idea of separation of powers, and perhaps the most important of all of these, really the prince of the Enlightenment, François-Marie Arouet, who you see in the picture there. We know him better as Voltaire. He is the writer of such novels as Candide, and he is one of those that invade very heavily against divine rule or rule by divine decree and against the slave trade. He's an interesting figure, though, because he corresponded with several monarchs of Europe, including Catherine the Great and Frederick the Great. And even though they were claimed rule by divine decree. Again, I say that the philosophers used the idea of reason, that you use the mental faculties and you use the evidence that is given to you to discern what is real in society, what is real in science, how things work. When it came to religion, many of these philosophers begin to encapsulate or define God as in a deist manner. That is, God is sort of a benign bystander to creation, has stood back from things and allows creation to work its own way after having done so, after having brought the world into being, if that makes any sense to you. Those like Jean-Jacques Rousseau gives us the idea of the social contract, that government and the people have a contract with each other, that the governed will obey the government and the government will take care of the people. There is, of course, the great Thomas Hobbes, who gives us Leviathan. Now, Leviathan tells about how government keeps human beings from devolving into a state of nature. That is, government can keep people from becoming savage and pursuing their own self-interest. It keeps people in line. It has the basic understanding that human beings are not all that great when left alone to their own devices. Hobbes, however, also says that you have to be careful with government, because government itself can become a Leviathan. That is, it can become all-encompassing and can start pursuing its own ends. Now, contrary to Hobbes, there is John Locke. Now, John Locke believed that human beings are a tabula rasa, that they are destined for good and are capable of good, and that what human beings have to have is personal liberty, especially when it comes to private property. And he believed in life, liberty, and property. And Locke also said that human beings have the right of rebellion should they find that their forms of government have become too restrictive and not helping them reach the greater heights that they were supposed to reach. While the Enlightenment really takes root in Europe, it has a role to play in the 13 colonies as well. However, the colonies and the colonists, for the most part, are focused on developing their economies. And so, while they do certainly read the works of Voltaire and Diderot and Rousseau and Montesquieu and so forth, the large part of their time is survival and creating a working economy. In the Caribbean, this is the wealthiest of the British colonies. You cannot leave the Caribbean out of the North American colonies. Very wealthy. Sugar plantations. Sugar was incredibly lucrative when it came to creating rum, but also for the baking industry. The southern colonies focused on rice, again, a very lucrative crop, but also in the backcountry raising cattle, and also the blue dye called indigo, which is the blue dye that is used in your blue jeans today. The Chesapeake economy was based largely upon tobacco. Tobacco was a crop that could be lucrative, but it also could be prone to periods of depression. The market fluctuated on the price of tobacco. Now, there are two regions in the Chesapeake. The older area is called the Tidewater. That is, all the areas along the coast, closest to the coast, where the rivers are not really rivers, they're tidal inlets. But then when you pass what is called the fall line, where the rivers now flow under their own power, and the ground begins to rise and becomes a little less fertile, this is the area called the Piedmont. Piedmont means the area right in front of the mountains or right next to the mountains. And the Piedmont settlers are later settlers. These are people that, have been pushed out of the Tidewater because there's not enough land. They move higher up, and they are not considered to be at the top rungs of society at first. Now, the New England economy was based on fishing and lumber, and from this comes the great shipbuilding ports of Boston, Portsmouth, New Haven, and so forth. And so New England becomes a merchant economy, the carrying trade, because New England, of course, does not have large tracts of arable soil. The soil is thinner and rockier there. So they focus on lumber and building ships and fishing off of the coasts. The Mid-Atlantic also with the Port of New York, the Port of Philadelphia, Port of Dover and Delaware. All of these places are merchant carrying trade places. And they begin to farm for lumber, but also staple crops, wheat and flaxseed. They're growing wheat to send down to the Caribbean. Then there's the backcountry. The backcountry is the area beyond the Piedmont, in the mountains or next to the mountains. And there, the economy is a little bit different. This is a frontier economy. Now, what is a frontier economy as opposed to a market economy? Let me make it very simple for you. When you go to Walmart or Sam's or Costco or any big box store or any grocery store, you pay a fixed price. The price is based on what the market says. In a frontier economy, you don't pay a price based on what the market says. You pay a price based on relationships. That is, if you've been out there trading for a long period of time and you come in with 30 beaver skins and you want to trade them, the frontier outpost is going to give you a price. If another guy comes in with 30 beaver pelts and wants to trade them, and he's only been there for, let's say, 6 months or so, and you've been there for 3 or 4 years, he's going to get a different price than you do. He's going to get a lesser price than you do because he does not have the relationship. That is what is called the frontier economy. The frontier economy is a market-based price based on, prices based rather than on markets, on relationships. I have already made mention of the declension model in the New England colonies and the Puritan closed corporate communities. The Puritans are multiplying, they're getting larger, the communities are becoming more diverse in their makeup, And so you're moving from a Puritan society, which is a religious-based society, to a Yankee culture, which is more of a market-based economy. It's not to say that they've lost their Puritanism. They have not in many ways. They are simply adapting on to the new demands of the colonial economy. How does this reflect, and what changes reflect this? Well, first of all, in order to create better preachers, many of these religious sects begin to develop their own schools, such as Harvard and Yale. Harvard, of course, in Massachusetts, Yale in Connecticut. You see a growing economic competition as well, as Harvard and Yale are producing good ministers, and they're also teaching liberal arts and so forth. You also have towns like Boston competing with New Haven, competing with Portsmouth, competing with New York. The Puritans are expanding further and further toward the frontier. You see towns like Boston, New Haven, Portsmouth, and others continuing to grow, and families continuing to grow. But New England is a constricted area. It doesn't have a lot of room for growth. Much of the colonial economy is going to pass the New England and go to the mid-Atlantic, to New York. Now, in the Chesapeake in the South, you see there an increase in African slavery. Now, slavery existed in all the colonies, but it was incredibly strong in the South. In 1662, the governments of the colonies begin to institutionalize human bondage. That is, they begin to regulate it. That is, they have to make sure that slaves are given certain protections, certain treatments, but it also seeks to control the movement of slaves and the things that slaves could do. In the South, because it's more of an agrarian region, there are few large cities. You have Charleston, of course, Wilmington, North Carolina, kind of a little town there. Richmond, Virginia is hardly more than a cluster of huts at the moment, and Williamsburg is really the big town in Virginia. In the South, tobacco in the Chesapeake produces a very moderate wealth. But rice, on the other hand, produces tremendous wealth. Because again, tobacco is subject to market fluctuations, whereas rice, which is a consumable, that is a staple crop, is not as subject to market forces. Now, if you go drive around Charleston, South Carolina, you see all those beautiful mansions along the waterfront and so forth. That's all built by the wealth of rice that was cultivated by slaves. The central nexus of colonial life, really, as far as economy and politics and governments go, are in the mid-Atlantic, because here you have the two largest cities, Philadelphia and then New York City. In New York City, you had a high population of free blacks in New York City. And as time goes on, we'll understand how free people of color, as they're called in Louisiana, and free blacks in the colonies become an inherent threat to the slave system. There's a high diversity of economy and culture. Philadelphia and New York City become manufacturing centers. They are very diverse communities. Therefore, you have many different cultural expressions. The Dutch majority in New York, the Quaker majority in Philadelphia and Pennsylvania begin to shrink. The Quakers and the Dutch, they encouraged that. From the beginning of the colonial experiment, they encouraged different peoples to move in. By 1688, the population of the colonies, that's the time of the Glorious Revolution, the colonies were about 250,000. By the eve of the revolution, colony's population was 2.5 million. That's an incredible increase in just a century. Why? The people were beginning to multiply. There's a large rise in native-born population. You also have a large migration of Irish that come from Ulster, that is Northern Ireland. They're called the Scots Irish because they're predecessors in some ways came from Scotland. They're not Catholic Irish. They are Presbyterian Calvinistic Irish. And these Scots-Irish immigrants begin to move into the back countries of South and North Carolina and Georgia and into New York and other places. You have families such as the Jackson family, the Buchanan family. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? You also see an increased movement west. As land becomes scarcer along the coast, people begin to look for more land, and now they're beginning to run against the crest of the Appalachian Mountains, and they want to move over that. There's two problems in that. One, there's still Indians living there, and two, the French are there. What is going to come of that? The Portuguese first dominated the slave trade during the early years of exploration. Then the Dutch took it over. And then after the English-Dutch wars in the 1660s, the English then take over the slave trade from the Dutch in 1685. The slave trade is marked by what is called the Middle Passage. The Middle Passage is the journey of the slaves from Africa to the Indies, the West Indies, and then North America. It's part of a three-way situation where you have the slaves producing goods that are brought back to England, and England then comes down to Africa to secure more slaves, and then they carry the slaves to the Indies in America. Please understand something, and I've said this before and I'll say it again. Africa is not a country. Africa is a continent. It's the second largest in the world. The slaves did not come from all over Africa. They came from two specific regions. The Senegambian region in West Africa and Angola, and where's the country of Angola and Namibia today in Southwest Africa. These people had culture, these people had civilization, and they bring with them, despite their captivity, many of their cultural customs. When they get to the Indies, where they are seasoned, and then, which means that they're trained to deal with the harsh conditions of temperature and disease in the Indies, then they are sent to work in North America. When they reach North America, you have two forms of labor: task labor and gang labor. Now, in task labor, workers are given a series of assigned tasks to be completed, and when they completed it, the work was done. That is, if you completed it at 3 o'clock, then you were finished for the day at 3 o'clock. If it took you till 6 o'clock, then you were finished at 6 o'clock. This required less supervision. All you had to do was to make sure that the tasks were done. With this amount of time left over, slaves begin to develop a very distinct African Creole culture. Now, the more brutal form of labor is gang labor. Now, here you have work arranged in gangs, and the hardiest are given the toughest work. But what that means is that you have less specialization, I should say, of tasks. That is, your job is to farm rice or cut cotton or pull up tobacco. Then that's what you did. That's all you did all day long. And you simply worked until the sun went down. And this meant that there was less time for socialization, less time for developing a culture. And so the later development of a culture takes place under gang labor. This map very roughly shows the triangle trade of slaves and goods between the Eastern Hemisphere and Western Hemisphere. From England came the ships, France and Spain as well, to West Africa and Southwest Africa. The slaves are taken from Southwest Africa in the red, and again, that's very rough. That's not the whole area, believe me. It's just simply a shading. And then they are taken to the east coast of South America and the southeast coast of North America, as well as the West Indies. And then goods and services that are produced by the slaves are then taken back to Europe, mostly England and France and Spain.